Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Natalia Moczulska and this is the news. Today, the European Union summit with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ended in Brussels. Topics of the talk centered around the problem of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The leaders of the 27 countries adopted conclusions on condemning Russia for kidnapping Ukrainian children, further sanctions and working to lower price ceilings on Russian oil. The European Council has adopted an agreement to establish an international center for the prosecution of crimes of aggression against Ukraine in The Hague. The issue is the abduction of children from occupied territories. According to Ukrainian experts, more than 16,000 such cases have been documented so far. Russia's violation of international law is one of Brussels' arguments for justifying further sanctions.
We have introduced the possibility in the 10th package on listing either personalities or companies or entities where we see, also in third countries, that they circumvent the sanctions. So a bundle of measures taken already, but this is certainly not enough, and therefore the 11th package of sanctions will also and mainly deal with the question of circumvention and how we can get against it.
According to Bloomberg News Agency, the U.S. State Department is looking into whether some banks helped Russian oligarchs evade sanctions. Among those being checked are Credit Suisse and UBS, whose uncertain fate is raising fears of a potential financial crisis. Equally important from Kiev's perspective are regular supplies of arms and ammunition, and these in turn depend on the capabilities of Ukraine's partners. This meeting was important because it allowed us to uphold the decision to supply ammunition to Ukraine. We want to be a fully committed partner that generously provides military support for both munitions production and delivery to Ukraine. This week, the European Union approved a plan to purchase ammunition for Ukraine. Brussels will put up 2 billion euros for this purpose. Half of the funds will finance the replenishment of the warehouses of those countries that will suffer losses from it. Poland will soon receive about 300 million euros from the European Enterprise Fund. Poland will be the biggest beneficiary of this European peace instrument. This is a huge success for Poland. It's very important. This is what we have been striving for from the very beginning, and I am very happy that it has been done. In place of the older weapons we have been transferring to Ukraine, we will be able to buy very modern weapons with money from the EU, but also ammunition. We'll also be able to create new technological lines for the production of ammunition and different types of weapons. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has once again asked the European Union for more military aid. He cited long-range missiles and fighter aircraft among the main needs. He also called for accelerating Ukraine's accession to the EU. If our efforts are determined and directed toward Ukraine's victory, if there are no delays and stoppages in our cooperation, we will achieve the final victory already this year. Every hour on the battlefield matters. A delay in the delivery of long-range missiles has a direct impact on the deaths of more Ukrainians. Without the right weapons, we cannot push back the Russians from around Kherson, Zaporizhia, and other cities. Dan Rice, an American advisor to the Ukrainian armed forces, said Vladimir Putin's decisions are dragging down the Russian military. Some 25,000 Russian soldiers are dying on the front lines every month. He also announced a Ukrainian counteroffensive, the success of which will shock the world. Meanwhile, the Russians are constantly shelling civilian facilities and critical infrastructure.
88% of Ukrainians' irrigated territories is under Russia occupation. 35% of those in the government-controlled area has suffered from hostilities. Precisely, there is territory critical for global food security. Every day, Russian missiles destroy Ukraine's water infrastructure, water supply facilities.
Meanwhile, Slovakia has already delivered the first 4 of the 13 promised MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, with the others expected to arrive in the coming weeks. A similar commitment has been made by Poland, which, like Slovakia, will hand over 4 fighters in the coming days. Today marks the National Day of Remembrance of Poles who saved Jews under German occupation. The choice of the date refers to the day on which the Germans murdered the Ulma family in Markowa in 1944. Józef, Victoria, and their children, along with the Jews hiding with them. Ceremonies were held today in Markowa with the participation of Polish President Andrzej Duda.
7 lat minęło od momentu, kiedy
It's been 7 years since we opened this extremely important museum together, a museum commemorating a family who lived in this place and who died in this place, in fact, giving their lives for helping another human being, for helping their fellow citizens, Poles of Jewish nationality, who lived on this land with them at the time when the German invader came here, occupied this land, and began their planned plot to destroy the Jewish people, their elimination in a ruthless, brutal manner, unseen until now in history. There were, at that time in our country, in Poland, people who had extraordinary courage, who had deeply inscribed in their hearts the ideals of humanity, respect for the life of another human being, that Christian love of neighbor, great ethos of the Republic, that Republic of many nations, which together over the years after regaining independence in 1918, they co-created as a free, independent, sovereign Poland.
Miłości bliźniego, tak, tej chrześcijańskiej.
Yesterday, more than 400 police officers were injured and nearly 500 people detained in France during riots that broke out during protests against the pension reform. Authorities estimate that about 1 million people took part in Thursday's demonstrations. Trade unions, however, say there were as many as 3.5 million protesters. Due to the protest, the visit of British King Charles III to France, which was scheduled to begin on Sunday, has been postponed. Last night, the trade unionists announced further protests for next week. So I have taken the decision that in view of the scheduled visit of His Majesty King Charles III and the Queen Consort, it would not be serious on our part and would lack common sense to offer a state visit to the royal couple under these circumstances. Given the respect and friendship we feel for His Majesty the King and Queen Consort and the British people, I spoke with King Charles III this morning and informed him of the situation. This should be arranged when calm is restored, so we suggested that the visit, depending on our schedules, could take place in early summer. I condemn all of this damage. The protesters' claims are completely legitimate. We can agree or disagree, but it is legitimate. It's just that the rules must be respected. For me, violence has never been a way to be heard. I'm lucky enough to have a job as a business executive working in an office, but I see workers carrying heavy loads or things like that, so I can understand when they are being told they will live 5 or 6 years in good health after they retire. Well, now we are taking back 2 of those years. It's something violent coming from the government. Last night, demonstrators clashed fiercely with police at the Paris Opera Square, where a protest against a reform raising the retirement age ended. Demonstrators set fire to a kiosk and police pelted protesters with Molotov cocktails, objects, and firecrackers, repeatedly launching counterattacks and using tear gas. In turn, rioters in Bordeaux, in the southwest of the country, set fire to the entrance to the city's city hall. In all, nearly 500 people were detained. More than 1 million people took part in protests across the country. Polls cited by the Associated Press show a majority of French people oppose President Emmanuel Macron's proposal to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, which he says is necessary to make the system work. After the collapse of U.S. banks and the forced takeover of Switzerland's Credit Suisse, it is now possible that Deutsche Bank will also line up for a bailout. Investors are already talking about a possible bankruptcy. Deutsche Bank's debt securities slid as much as 13% during today's session, with shares of other major European banks losing ground. UniCredit decreased by more than 5%, Credit Suisse by 7%, and Commerzbank by more than 8%. Could Germany's largest bank with about $1.4 trillion in assets and $880 billion in assets under management collapse? For now, only share prices have fallen by 11% today and by more than 24% over the past month. The depreciation on the stock markets was provoked by a jump in the cost of CDS for Deutsche Bank, the papers that insure its debt. Typically, the higher the cost of this insurance, the more investors perceive a bank or company to be at risk of default. Deutsche Bank has had financial problems for a long time. However, the current market situation is very tight due to the ongoing banking crisis. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please stay tuned for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and some of our other programs. But for me, have a wonderful weekend.